Hello and welcome to this video. This is VBA Unit 2. We will be talking about variables and simple programs that use input, assignment, and output. But before we get to that, I want you to stop and solve this problem. Stop the video and solve this problem. This is a word problem like you'd have in a 5th grade math class or something like that. Jake has a car with an 8-gallon fuel tank. Jake fills his tank with gas and then drives 60 miles to a friend's house. When he gets to his friend's house, he has 6 gallons left in his fuel tank. How far can Jake travel on a full tank of gas? Go ahead and stop reading and stop the video now and get out a sheet of paper, solve the problem, and I want you to do more than just come up with an answer. I also want you to do all your partial work, right? So write down everything that's in your head as you try to solve this problem. And then push pause and I'll resume the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, at this point I hope you solved this problem. Hope you have some numbers written down on a sheet of paper. The answer, how far Jake can travel, is 240 miles on a full tank of gas. But I wanted you to work that out, and you probably have some numbers written down, right? So you probably have some things like this. 8 minus 6 is equal to, or an arrow pointing to 2 somehow. You probably have 60 divided by 2 is the value 30. You probably have the value 240. You got that by doing 30 times 8. So all those numbers are probably on your sheet of paper somewhere. These are values that were relevant to solving this problem, coming up with the final answer. On pencil paper, you just write them down. In a computer program, we have to store each of these numbers in a variable. A variable in a computer program is a storage location that holds a value, a number, a string, whatever we want. And some of these values, like 8 and 6, some of these values are special values, 8, 6, and 60. Do you know what's special about those 3 values? Well, they were all given to us in the problem. 8-gallon fuel tank, 60 miles to a friend's house, 6 gallons left, right? So those were all input values. Then we also have some values like 2, 30, and 30 again, and 240. Okay. So these values, 2, 30, and 240, these are calculated values. We didn't know these values were given, right? They're input, they're given as part of the problem. And calculated values are determined determined from the inputs, right? So they're not explicitly stated anywhere. The idea that there's 2 gallons of fuel left is not given in the word problem, but it can be inferred from the given data. The fact you get 30 miles per gallon is not stated in the word problem, but it can be inferred or calculated from the data stated in the word problem. And the 240 miles on a full tank of gas is not given in the word problem, it's inferred. So there are variables that get their values from input, and there are variables that get their values through calculations, but they're variables in each case. So let's pull up Excel and write the solution to this problem. So here's a new Excel file. I'll go in the Developers tab and pull up the Visual Basic Editor, and here's my Visual Basic Editor. I'm going to right-click in the Project Explorer window and add a insert a module. So here's my module here. Under the Tools options, under the Tools menu, you can see the options. You can change, turn off the checkbox for syntax check, and under the editor you can change the font size. I've got mine to be 16, which is a little bigger than it is by default. I think it's 12 or so by default, but I like to have some more size there so it's easier to see. So I'm going to create a subroutine to solve Jake's problem. Begin with the keyword sub and then the name of the subroutine. And when I press enter, it'll automatically add the parentheses for arguments, and there's no arguments. Arguments are how you pass data into the subroutine. We don't need to do that here. And it automatically adds the end sub for me. Now, if I had tried to say Jake's with an apostrophe, it would have griped. Okay, it didn't like that, or it didn't do what I wanted. Or if I would have put a space there between Jake's and problem, it wouldn't like that. Subroutine names have and variable names, which we're about to talk about, have the same rules that they have to begin with a letter, can contain only letters, digits, and underscore symbols. So no exclamation points, no dollar signs, no @ symbols, no quotes or double quotes. Just numbers, letters, and the underscore. I could do this, Jake's underscore problem. That would be fine. It'll let me do an underscore. But I don't use underscores very much. Every once in a while, not very often. You just put the words together, and it looks weird from a English class standpoint, but from a programming standpoint, it means it's one variable that might have multiple words rushed together. And it doesn't matter if you do uppercase or lowercase, right? Uppercase and lowercase are fine. So no spaces, and it can't be, the other rule is it can't be these words that are in blue, like sub and end sub. Those are reserved words. The editor will show you those words in blue when you're doing them. So I'm going to write this code to solve Jake's problem, just like we did on pencil and paper, but we're going to write a program to do it. To do this, I need some variables to hold all those values, to hold the 3 input values and to hold the 3 calculated values. We declare input variables using a statement called dim, which means dimension, or it means dimension. It's reserving some space in memory to hold a value. So it's creating a bucket, not literally a bucket, but the idea of a bucket that we're going to place something into. It's creating a holding space. And that holding space is not a bucket, but it's actually a space in memory, and you're dimensioning how big that space needs to be for the type of thing that I'm holding. So the keyword's dim, and what we use here is the name of the variable. Now, I've got my program here back in Word where I've got all these values, 8, 6, 2, 60, 30, and 240. Each of these is going to have its own name. So let's think about this. Let's go back here to our input values. Our input values from our Word problem, Jake has an 8-gallon fuel tank. Okay, so that's going to be one of our inputs. 60 miles to a friend's house. He drove 60 miles, 6 gallons left. So those are all inputs. Now, what do I want to call these variables? I'm going to call, how about tank size? And how about fuel left? And how about miles traveled? Right. So those are the, I don't like the extra space in there. I don't need that for my note-taking purposes. So those are going to be, those are all input values. We're going to store 8, 6, and 30, 60 into those. And then our calculated variables are going to be the value 2. What would be a good name for this value 2? Right? What does that represent? Is it 2 tacos for lunch? Is it 2 birds singing on a wire? No, it's 2 somethings. In this case, that 2 represents how much gas was used or fuel used. Okay. And when you name your variables, the same rules apply. You can call them anything you want, but it should begin with a letter, letters, numbers, and underscores only, and I rarely use the underscores, no spaces, and it can't be a reserved word. A variable name can be, there's a bit of an art in naming a variable, and you'll get comfortable over time. Variables that are too short, like F could be fuel used, but F could also be Fahrenheit, or F could be Frankfurts, right? Or F can be flags, or farmland, or anything. So F is probably too generic. And fuel used by Jake driving to his friend's house could be the variable name, but that's probably too long. Right? So something that's long enough to be descriptive, but short enough that as short as possible and still be descriptive. So same thing with this number 30. What does 30 represent? It doesn't represent a person's IQ, right? It doesn't represent the temperature outside in Celsius. 30 represents how many miles Jake's car gets on a gallon of gas. So I need a variable for that. I could just say M, which represents miles Jake gets on his car in a gallon of gas, but M's too vague for that. And I could say miles Jake's car gets on a gallon of fuel, but that's probably too long, right? Miles per gallon is probably what I want to say, or even MPG. So I need to come up with a variable name that's just long enough to be descriptive, but not any longer than that. And this last variable, 240, what do you think 240 represents? Well, it's how far Jake can travel on a full tank of gas. I could just say distance, but that's really not very good, right? I don't like distance as a variable name for that 240 because he traveled, we got a couple distances. 60 was also a distance, how far he got when he drove to his friend's house, right? So maybe something like max distance. That's not the distance to his friend's house, but that's a max distance he can get on his full tank of gas. So all I'm doing is I'm translating these numbers that we have on pencil paper. We've got to store them in the computer, and the computer can't read our pencil paper. We've got to give them storage locations called variables. So getting back to my program here, let's do that. We've got tank size. Now, when we declare a variable, interesting. When we declare a variable, we don't have to do the variable type, but let's go ahead and do the variable type because it's the best programming habit. When you declare a variable, you also say what it is. And double means it's going to be a number and it has the option of having a decimal place. And all of these are numbers that have the option of decimal place. Tank size, fuel used, and miles traveled. This uppercase, lowercase technique that I'm using is called camel case, where the first letter is typically lowercase, but each subsequent word in a multi-word variable name or a multi-word procedure name, each subsequent word is capitalized. In VBA, cases don't matter. These could be all capital letters or all lowercase letters or every other letter capital and every even letter lowercase. And it's the same thing. It doesn't care. There are some programming languages that the way you capitalize makes a big difference. VBA doesn't. I also need my variables for my storage location. So those are all my three inputs. I'm going to actually put a comment over here. Remember, a single quote is a comment. It highlights in green, and it's ignored by the VBA computer, but it's there for human eyes as feedback. So now I've got my three variables. Sorry, that was the input is fuel left, and the output is fuel used. I know you saw me make that mistake, and you were yelling at the screen. I just now heard you. The sound just now made it to my recording that I made in the past. Fuel used, this is a calculated value. Miles per gallon is a calculated value. And max distance is a calculated value. Okay? So, how do we do input? How do we do calculations? How do we do output? That's the topic of this unit. And we can write some interesting programs that just have input, assignments, or calculations and outputs. So let's get our values here. Tank size. Now the way we do this in VBA is we have the variable on the left of what's called an assignment statement. Variable equals something. This is the structure of an assignment statement. Variable equals something. Now on the right hand side of for an input, we use something called input box, and then in parentheses we have one argument, which is the string we're going to prompt to the user. You can see from the pop-up that it's the prompt, and then there's some more optional things. They're in square brackets here, so we don't have to do it. You can put a title on the dialog box and XY position and other things. We're not going to do any of those things, but the prompt doesn't have the brackets. It's required, and I'm going to, this is the message the user sees. Please, how large is, how many gallons can Jake's car hold? How many gallons of fuel? And I was struggling with exactly the way to word that question because, again, we want to be clear to our user. That's what the user is going to see, and they want to know that I'm asking for the size in gallons, not in feet and inches, because you could measure a tank size in volume, right? So you want to be clear as possible in the message that you give to the user. It's okay to use a single quote inside of the double quotes, but the prompt itself has to have matching or delimiting double quotes. And everything inside those double quotes, including the single quote, Jake-S, apostrophe S, is going to appear literally to the user. The user will type in a value there, and it'll get saved in tank size. Now, just to verify this, well, no, okay. Now I'm going to do the fuel left. How many gallons left after trip to friend's house? And closing parenthesis, and miles traveled is equal to input box. How far did Jake travel? Okay, so those are our inputs. If I want to put a comment here, I can do that, and then these are going to be my calculated values. Fuel used. Now, how do I calculate fuel used? On in the pencil paper solution, I know the answer is 2, and I got that by saying 8 minus 6. So I could say 2 here, but I don't want to do that, and I also don't want to say 8 minus 6. Right? Even though that's the way I'm going to calculate my fuel used, it's going to end up being a 2. This isn't the way to calculate it, because if I run the program and I don't enter 8 for this, then I won't have the value here. What I'm saying is I want to use variable names, not constants, to represent the values that are given as input variables. So it's really tank size minus fuel left. Okay. So whenever possible, we want to avoid using constants, and we want to use variables, because now I can run the program and I can run it for Jake can drive to a different friend's house, or he has a different car, or whatever, and we can make the program work. So same thing with miles per gallon. Miles per gallon is equal to tank size divided by fuel used. Now, fuel used. Okay, so I misspelled fuel used, and Visual Basic doesn't gripe. F-U-L-E is not the correct spelling. F-U-E-L is what I want to use there. If you have a typo, Visual Basic will let you have typos. And to get to that, I have miles per gallon, and here I have mile per gallon. So those are not the same. Is there any way that I can tell Visual Basic to help me with these errors? Because I've got 2 of them in my program right now, and I might not have noticed them. The good news is there is something you can do. You can go up above the sub, outside of the sub, above it. the top of your code editor, and you can say something called option explicit. And that means all your variable names have to be defined. Now, it's not griping right now, but when I run the program, it's going to complain that mile per gallon and miles per gallon are different. And it's going to complain, that miles per gallon is not defined, and it's going to complain that misspelled fuel used is not defined. I'm going to leave those two errors in here intentionally so that you can see the effect of the option explicit. Max distance is equal to, and again, the variables that I want to, using just those variable names at the top that I've declared, I can figure out my max distance to be the tank size times the miles per gallon. Notice how I did multiplication. It's not an X, it's an asterisk, just like in Excel. When you do multiplication in Excel, you don't use an X, you use an asterisk. And that's because the computer, X is a possible variable name. So we don't want to use X, we want to use something that's unconfusing. Now, our output, the way we do our output, and we saw this last time, message box allows us to repeat something like hello world. Okay. But in this case, I don't want to say hello world, I want to say how far Jake can travel. Okay. So there I've got my program. I'm going to put white space before the end sub. I've got white space, a blank line after the first sub. The white space here and here and here, blank lines, white space, doesn't matter to the computer. It just makes our program easier to read. Also note, it doesn't matter to the computer. It makes our program easier to read. The sub and the end sub create a block, and everything between the sub and the end sub, that block, the body of that block is indented. Everything's indented one tab. That's good programming style. It looks good on the eyes. So go ahead and get used to writing your code with a tab between the sub and the end sub. That'll be more important later as we start talking about loops and conditions and nested levels of blocks. So let's go ahead and run this. Now with the option explicit, when I run this, it's going to gripe about my variable names not being defined. So let me click run. And variable name not defined, right? And it's highlighting for me fuel used. So let me correct the spelling on that. And I'm right now in something called break mode. When it has this line highlighted in yellow, it's telling me that it was trying to run the program, but it ran into a problem. This subroutine has a variable in it that's not defined, it's not dimmed. To get out of break mode, to make that yellow go away, you click the reset button that is now active while I'm in break mode. I click reset. I guess the button's always active, but the yellow goes away by resetting. I can run it again. I'll go get the same problem because I have two. I told you there were two typos. Miles per gallon is not defined because here it says mile per gallon. So I can do it mile per gallon everywhere or miles per gallon everywhere, just so long as I'm consistent. And I like miles per gallon. And again, to get rid of this break, I hit the reset button. Now when I run it, put the cursor inside the subroutine and run, how many gallons can Jake's car hold? 60, it can hold 8 gallons. 6 when he gets to his friend's house, and 60 miles traveled. Jake can travel, 32 on a full tank of gas. So something was wrong with my program. Don't be alarmed when your program doesn't get the right answer. It's usually going to be the case that your program doesn't work the first time, and you have to go through and look at your logic. So I think my logic's okay. Usually the problem is a variable name is wrong. And then when that's not the case, the most common problem is that your logic is just not what you want. So input tank size, fuel left, miles traveled. Tank size minus fuel left, that's right for fuel used. Tank size divided by fuel used, miles per gallon. Is it tank size divided by fuel used? No, that doesn't make sense. It's miles. It's miles traveled divided by fuel used. All right, so I went 60 miles at 2 gallons. Okay, so that was an honest mistake. Uh, I didn't notice that when I was typing that in. You probably maybe noticed that when you were typing it. That's perfectly fine. I didn't notice that. But my output was wrong, so I was like, something's wrong, so go back and find it. So let me try this again with the correct statement there. How many gallons does it hold? 8. After driving to his friends, he got 6. How far did he travel? 60 miles. And Jake can travel 200 more miles on a full tank of gas. Now, my output actually says Jake can travel 240 on a full tank of fuel. That's because I literally have Jake can travel, including a space, and then ampersand to concatenate. The variable max distance without quotes, VBA will give you the value of the variable. So it replaces that with 240 or 60 or 8 or 2 or whatever the value of that is. Concatenate, ampersand to concatenate, and then space on a full tank of gas. If I want to put the word miles in there, so-and-so miles on a full tank of gas. Or, yeah, like full tank of gas. It sounds better than full tank of fuel. So-and-so miles on a full tank of gas. So pretty neat. That's the way we can do programs. And there's so many programs you can write using just input, simple input, using an input box, simple assignment statements, and simple output statements. Now there's one other way of doing this. Another option for writing these programs is to use the spreadsheet. We're not actually using the spreadsheet in the program we just wrote. Let's just real quick see a second version of this where we get our stuff from the spreadsheet. Jake's problem, and I'll have our inputs here are tank size and fuel left and miles traveled. So those are prompts. We'll resize this, and I want the user to type those values in these cells. So I'm going to highlight that for the user. And I'll even put little boxes around this. This doesn't really matter, but I'm going. Okay. Jake's problem. Boom, 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 and then the answer is going to go here. Actually, I'll leave that. I'll put that message in that cell. Okay. So when I'm going to put a button on here, when the user clicks the button, the user types the input in here and clicks a button and makes the program work. So how do I do this? This is another way of doing input, assignment, output that uses the spreadsheet. Under Developer tab, there's an insert option in controls, and the first form control there is something called a button. Okay. So click on that, and then you can just paint or drag and drop, which is called painting sometimes, but you drag and drop on the form and it creates a button for you. And it's going to ask you to say, okay, I need code for this button. You've already got code in your module for Jake's problem. Do you want to use that or do you want to use a different one? I want to use a different one. I'm going to call this spreadsheet version, range version of Jake's problem. Remember, our name of our subroutines can't have any spaces, so that's why it looks weird because I'm not putting any spaces in there, but I've got the range version of Jake's problem, and you click the new button, it creates a new subroutine. Now, it created a new module, so I've got module 1 that had what I wrote before, and I've got module 2 over here, which is the range version. You can make those. I'm going to copy this over to the same module. Copy and paste. Okay. And the code's going to be identical. I'm just going to copy the whole thing because most of this code is identical. The only thing that's different is my input. Tank size is not getting this, it's getting it from the spreadsheet in cell, where was it at? There it is. whoops, I'm in a format here where instead of letters I've got numbers. I can change that real quick by going under data, under file, options, data, formulas R1C1. You probably don't have that set on yours. I was doing that for something else. This is the normal way, ABC, just like the song across the top, 1, 2, 3, just like a ruler down the side. So the tank size is in C4, so I'm going to put C4. Okay? And that maybe is easier, I'm not sure. It's the same to VBA. It's your choice as the developer. Do you want to use the data from a spreadsheet, or do you want to use dialog boxes? Excel's happy to do it either way. The calculations are the same, and now my output box, instead of saying message box this whole thing, I'm going to say that range, how about C7 or C8, I'll skip a line, is equal to that same message. So it's the exact same message, but instead of doing a message box, which is dialog, I'm going to take that exact same message, Jake can travel, concatenate the value inside the variable distance, concatenate miles on a full tank of gas. And when I run this program, it gets the data from the sheet. And this button runs it for me. 8, 6, 240, 60. Jake can travel 240 miles on a full tank of gas. So it's the same thing, input, assignment, output, but you have two ways of doing input. You can do inputs from an input box, which is a dialog box that pops up and the user responds to, and output through a dialog box, message box. Right? Input box, dialog box, message box, dialog box. Or you can do input from ranges and output to ranges. When you use the ranges, make sure you do it this way. It's always variable on the left equals the input range that has the value. And your output is the left-hand side of the assignment statement. I want the results to go into the spreadsheet, and the right-hand side is what's being copied. Assignment statements are always the left-hand side is what changes equals the right-hand side is what it's going to become. So again, you'll get used to it. You've got some homework problems to work on to get this done. So get the assignment, look at your homework problems, and give it a shot.